Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our show Perspective, where we bring you detailed analysis of key national and international issues as well. Today we're going to talk about the issue of inflation, the challenge inflation poses, and how do we deal with or tackle the surge in inflation in India. Now, as per the latest data from National Statistical Office, India's retail inflation has accelerated to 7.41% in September from 7% in August, with food price inflation surging sharply from 7.62% in August to 8.6% in September. Country's rural inflation has also picked up further stream from 7.15% in August to reach 7.56% in September month, while urban consumers have also experienced a resurgence in price rise at 7.27% from 6.72% just a month ago. Now, this is the 9th month in a row when inflation has stayed above the Reserve Bank of India's upper tolerance threshold of 6%. As per the RBI Act, now the central bank will have to submit a report to the central government detailing reasons for the failure to contain prices and also remedial steps to rein in inflation or price rise. Meanwhile, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has said that Budget 2023, that is next year's budget, will be carefully structured to address the dual challenges of high inflation and slowing economic growth as well. She also said that Indian economy is expected to grow at 7% in the current financial year, that is 2022-23. So what are the challenges here when we're talking about the surging inflation and what needs to be done to tackle this high inflationary pressure? For more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of experts. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with Mr. A.K. Bhattacharya is joining us. He is the editorial director of Business Standard. Welcome, Mr. Bhattacharya, here in the studios. Mr. R. Gopalan, former Secretary Financial Services in the Government of India, is also with us, and so is Rajani Sinha, Chief Economist with CareEdge Group. Welcome, both of you as well, to Sansad Television. I'll begin with you, Mr. Bhattacharya. Let me start by asking a very simple question. How serious is the problem and how big is the challenge when we're talking about inflation?
Well, inflation, when it is above the RBI mandated upper tolerance level of 6%, has to be serious. So that's number one. Number two is that this is, as you said, this is the 9th month in a row that it has stayed above that tolerance, upper tolerance band of 6%. That makes it even more serious because it seems that inflation, for whatever be the reasons, is now deeply embedded in the economy. And that gives rise to its own problem of inflationary expectations in the economy. Point number three is that this inflation is also serious because it is led and driven by food. Now, if you look at the core inflation, which is minus food and fuel and transportation and gold, it is slightly lower at 6.8%. It stayed the same level. So it is a food inflation and the vegetables and items like that, which have contributed to this rise. So it cannot be just wished away by saying, oh, it is imported inflation alone. It is the domestic food economy which is giving you some sort of a problem. And final point, I would say, in the preliminary stage of our comments is that given the way the monsoon has behaved and given the way that the rice production is going to see a drop of 6%. That's the latest estimates are telling us. So the food inflation is not going to go away very easily, and one has to wait and watch.
Okay.
The October number, which will be out next month, that what kind of action plan the Reserve Bank of India puts forward in its December monetary policy review.
We'll come to that part as well, that what is to be done by both the central bank and the government as well. But staying with those numbers, and Mr. Gopalan, I'd like to bring you in here. 9 months and counting, the inflation number seems to be steadily on a rise. In terms of understanding the reasons, would you want to add on to what Mr. Bhattacharya was pointing out? Food inflation seems to be, one major contributor to the overall figures here which we're looking at.
Absolutely. Mr. Bhattacharya had hit the nail on the head. Well, before that, you should also look into how the core inflation was behaving before the Ukraine conflict. That was also going up, looking very steady at higher band rate, which indicated that there is a possibility that inflation was getting entrenched. That is one thing which was followed also by the fact that the reserve money growth rate was higher than that of the M3. So there were underlying pressures on account of that as well. Obviously, your Ukraine war put a difficulty on the supply side, and therefore the commodity prices, international commodity prices got up, and also the oil prices also, which we import in substantial measure, that also went up, and that has gone into creating the inflation which we see today. But the second order inflation of this impact has not fully played out. So that is one reason why you are seeing this kind of entrenched inflation numbers, especially on the core inflation side. I'll stop at this point in time.
Okay, let me bring in Ms. Rajani Sinha here as well. Ms. Sinha, what would be your analysis of these surge in inflation numbers which we are witnessing for the past few months? Is it as entrenched as we are looking at right now, or if we go back into time, we might perhaps see that we've dealt with faced such situations earlier as well and dealt with them as well also?
So, like the previous panelist highlighted, right now the inflation is mainly because of food. But if you look at how the whole story started, the inflation cycle, it started with imported inflation, and then it has got deeply entrenched. And to make matters worse now, so initially it was more because of global reasons, global supply bottlenecks, global commodity prices being high. Now, to make matters worse, we also have high domestic food price inflation. And yes, it has got entrenched in the system. There is a lot of pent-up demand also in the economy. So if you look at the economic recovery, while the consumption from the lower income category, middle to lower income category is still weak, there is strong consumption demand that we are seeing from the high income category. And that pent-up demand is pushing up inflation also in the service sector. So yes, inflation has got deeply entrenched. And the big concern is also that if the food inflation is high, which is the case right now, it will also put pressure on inflationary expectations, and which will in turn result in core inflation going up further. And even now, if you see, the core inflation is also high. It's not just food inflation. And there is risk of core inflation going up further if this pressure on food inflation continues.
Mm-hmm.
But having said that, I would like to highlight that there could be some respite going forward, because in the next few months, with the base effect playing, we could see inflation going down below 7%. And by the end of the fiscal year, it could go below 6% or so by March 2023. Okay. So the base effect will have a play there. And also, if we look at the global commodity prices, while they are still high, but in the last 4-5 months, we have seen a significant fall in global commodity prices, including crude oil prices from the highs that we had seen few months back. Mm-hmm. So while yes, inflation is a concern, but we are seeing some respite from some corners.
Okay. Mr. Bhattacharya, do you agree with that part there that, the base effect might bring down the inflation numbers in the coming few months, and also the global impact, which we are looking at right now, that imported inflation which we are talking about, global commodities, crude oil prices as well, they are at a higher level, not in the comfort zone, but still at a lower level, as Ms. Sinha was pointing out, than perhaps what they were around 6 months ago. Is that likely to continue given the geopolitical situation as well? Because, the conflict or the war situation is nowhere seen.
Well, there is no doubt, as Ms. Sinha was pointing out, that there will be a base effect, and that will keep probably the inflation rate at around 6%. But remember that 6% is still touching the upper tolerance band, which is imposed by RBI. Nobody is even talking about what is the actual inflation target. Mm-hmm. The real inflation target is 4%. So if we believe that it will come down to 6% by the next 6 months or 3 months or 4 months, and yet it will be 2% above what is supposed to be the inflation target, which the RBI itself and in consultation with the government is considered to be the inflation target.
6% is the upper threshold.
Upper threshold. So therefore, I mean, it's good to sort of seek some comfort by saying that it will not remain at 7%, it will come down to 6%. But remember that inflation of a 6% rate is probably the worst kind of tax that is paid by the poorest of the poor. So therefore, I think inflation will continue to be a cause for concern. And not without reason, the finance minister has, in a sense, modified her budgetary goals to a great extent by saying that concern will not be just growth, but is also inflation. And I think I just cannot but point out at this stage that Reserve Bank of India's approach to the entire idea of tackling inflation probably is now beginning to hurt its own approach to this issue, because it has been behind the curve in that sense that it should have acted a little earlier. And I think when things were probably they could have managed it, but they did not manage it well. Now 4 consecutive rate cycles, one of which was an out of cycle rate hike, will have to be followed up by another 50 basis points in December. But will that really help? I think it will help temper the sentiment a little bit for making sure that inflation is brought back. You need a whole set of new measures, and that would include the supply side measures by ensuring that the lower half of the economy, which is the lower leg of the K, in my view, that is taken care of, because it is that part of the economy which is really getting hurt the most. And that is also, remember, politically very, very significant for a government that will be going into elections next year, not just the general election, but also many important assembly elections. Indeed. So I think inflation is becoming not just an economic issue, but it is also becoming a big political issue right now.
Okay, and indeed, economy and politics are, very closely intertwined with each other. Mr. Gopalan, your views on this aspect here, as Mr. Bhattacharya was referring to, in terms of dealing with this surge. One is the central bank stance, the other is what needs to be done by the government in terms of policy measures as well. The FM statement is a clear indication that the government seemingly is going to, remodel its budgetary approach towards the dual target of dealing with inflation and growth as well. But in hardcore terms, what is it that needs to be done on the ground?
Well, obviously, the entrenched inflation of the core type, and also food inflation seeping into the general inflation, raising expectations and entrenching itself, is to be tackled first. Now, as Mr. Bhattacharya says, I also agree that RBI was behind the curve. Maybe not too long, but my guess is it's behind the curve for about 6 months before the Ukraine war. That was my understanding of the numbers. So you have a problem now of supply issues, in prices going up. OPEC Plus has reduced the supply, but you may argue that recession is around the corner in various advanced economies, and therefore that will soften. But once again, please understand that our exchange rate, in any case, thanks to strengthening of the dollar, is, depreciating fast, and therefore probably what will be the effect of the weakening commodities on our inflation is something I'm not able to exactly, tell you. The second issue is I am worried about is all these things getting into the market and in what manner it is going to affect the financial stability. Now, financial stability is very, very important. In what manner it is going to affect the financial stability as we go along is something we need to really focus on. There are issues relating to liquidity. Liquidity is getting fast sucked up, and you have there are other issues which on the liquidity side, which the Reserve Bank will have to take steps. What can be done is a very, very good question. What can be done to beat this? Now, obviously, one may think that public capex should be increased, because the private investment is not showing any signs of showing resurgency, thanks to a number of issues, tight financial conditions, then global growth being what it is. The private capital is not really going to push the growth. So what we need to really do is obviously ensure that capex, especially public capex, is able to push that. But once again, there is a limitation on inflation. What inflation it can cost and what fiscal deficit it can cost. So there is another, other side to the whole issue regarding accelerating public expenditure.
Okay.
In addition, Mr. Bhattacharya will also agree with me that the capacity of the government to really spend on capital expenditure is also not very big. There are, I always used to say that, there are very many ways in which the government has to ensure that its public expenditure is able to, capital expenditure is able to do it in a big way, but that's not happening. There are many reasons. That's a subject for a different, discussion. So what are the ways finance minister can look at? One is unproductive spending, getting them cut, and also less giveaways. There's another area where one can look at. These are all unproductive spending. So how can you cut that? Second, on the tax issue, how compliance can be enhanced. Your tax to GDP ratio, is overall, if you take both the center and state together, maybe about 23, 24. What should be 23, 24, but what we are having is far less at this point in time. So how to ensure that the technology is used in a very, very serious manner to ensure that this kind of a difficulty is, looked into.
Okay.
And accelerate the asset sales. That is another important thing, which I think is something which we need to ensure that the government is able to apply its accelerator on that.
Okay.
There have been some reasons in the past as to why they could not do, but now they should be at whatever good price they can get, they should be in a position to dispose of the assets.
Okay.
There, some amount of speed is to be exhibited. I think these are some of the steps I think one should take at this point in time.
Okay. Ms. Sinha, your suggestions there, in addition to what Mr. Gopalan is pointing out in terms of be it the policy measures, short-term and long-term both, and of course, the stance which needs to be taken by the central bank.
So I feel we also have to look at inflation from the global perspective. If you see, it's not just a domestic phenomena, it's a global phenomena. And in that sense, we are doing much better than what the other economies, so-called developed economies, are going through. So US, EU, UK, who have a target of 2% inflation, CPI inflation, are struggling right now with 8-9% of inflation. So that's the kind of inflationary concerns that is there globally because of various reasons, the pandemic, the war, various supply bottlenecks. So that's the situation, that's the backdrop in which we are placed. So we have to appreciate that even when we are talking about the 6 to 7% inflation, we are much better placed than many of the other economies. Now, coming to what the central bank and the government can do, I agree that RBI started late on this and they started hiking rates late. But in fact, so did the other central banks. In fact, all of them kind of got it wrong, how severe the problem of inflation could get. And that's the reason why we saw all the central banks starting late and then hiking very rapidly. So, but also, while RBI has hiked rates by around 190 basis point or so, but there's a limitation to how much the central bank will be able to control inflation, because inflation, currently the situation in which we are, the supply side constraints are more. While the demand side is also picking up, but the demand side is still not that strong. And the inflation that we have currently, the food inflation, the core inflation, is still mainly because of supply side constraint.
Okay.
And hence, RBI will have its limitations. RBI can only influence the inflationary expectations, and that they have been doing.
Okay.
So here, there's a role that the government will have to play. And I think the government also, if you see what has been happening in the last few months, we have come up with a number of measures which has helped to control inflation at these levels compared to what we had, say, a couple of months back.
Okay.
Government has come up with various measures in the form of duty cut on fuel, basically controlling the supply side. So the government has imposed restrictions on a lot of exports. Import duty has been cut for some items. So in terms of supply side measures, I feel the government has announced measures to contain inflation, and if required, we may see some of those measures going forward also.
Okay.
But I think the way the situation is, maybe it won't be required, because I still feel that global commodity prices could go down further from these levels.
Okay.
Because if you're talking about a global slowdown happening, demand slowing down, that is likely to keep commodity prices low.
Okay.
But having said that, it's difficult to see what has been happening on crude oil prices and energy prices with the global development. It's difficult to be very sure on commodity prices remaining falling further from here. But I think there are more chances of that going down than going up.
Okay.
And with the base effect playing up, I think we are likely to get a control on inflation in the months to come.
Okay, okay, that's a pretty positive outlook there. But Mr. Bhattacharya, in terms of the concluding remarks, when we're talking about the steps which need to be taken, as Mr. Gopalan was underlining, and Ms. Sinha is pointing out that perhaps more of the load will have to be shared by the central government here in terms of the policy initiatives, measures as well. Looking at the supply side, central bank, of course, will have its work cut out in terms of next MPC. But what exactly, tangible terms, what should be done?
I think let me be brief and take off from where Mr. Gopalan left. Mr. Gopalan touched upon a very, very important issue, which is what has been the fiscal stance of the government, and that's where the government can do a lot. A lot of people, a lot of us actually focus too much on the central fiscal deficit, central government fiscal deficit, which is being brought down to 6.4%. But we don't realize this is the third year running that the total central and the state government deficit will be in double digits. Now, if you run a deficit of both the governments, the center and the states, over 10% for 3 consecutive years, you are naturally building inflationary expectations in the economy. So whatever you may do, I think the next budget, if it has to tackle both inflation and ensure growth, it must focus on ensuring and sending out a clear signal that both the government, as well as probably sending a signal to the states, that fiscal deficit must be reined in and brought down to the path that was outlined a few years ago under the Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act, which has almost been forgotten now. Number one. Number two, use this opportunity to expedite asset sale, to expedite non-tax revenues, because tax revenues in this current state of economy will have very limited potential.
Okay.
So both non-tax revenue as well as asset sale can help raise resources to bring down fiscal deficit, which is very critical to tamp down on the inflationary expectations that is growing in the economy, in my view.
Okay, okay. So bring in more money, stay on the path of fiscal
reduce
prudence.
Fiscal deficit.
Yeah, that's what the key element here is. Yeah. And of course, look at other key aspects there also. Thank you so much, Mr. Bhattacharya, Ms. Rajani Sinha, and Ms. R. Gopalan as well for sharing your views and insight with us and our viewers. As our experts were pointing out, of course, it is a situation of huge concern in terms of the surge in inflation or the inflationary pressure which is building up right now. And of course, not all of it is due to domestic reasons, but not all of it can be attributed to the global reasons as well. Both the central government and the central bank will have to tread carefully here, take policy decisions, ensure fiscal prudence, and bring in more money so that can be utilized to bring down the inflationary pressure. We'll come back again. We'll keep a close watch on this one and several other topics as well. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.